working your way through what has been described as a level 3 weather warning. I am not quite sure what that means, but we are here and we're giving thanks, and we're giving thanks to the ancestors who have joined us in this space, whose shoulders we stand upon. So welcome to you all. My name is Jendayi Serwah, independent consultant who is facilitating this evening's conversation on behalf of Black Southwest Network. So we are here to talk about I Am Witness, the role of testimony in the reparatory justice process. So I want to start by introducing the panel and to send apologies from Cis Councillor Amira Cole, who had some urgent family matters that she had to attend to. So we're delighted that Brother Madu from the Afrikan ConneXions Consortium has stepped in to the breach. So in terms of the Afrikan ConneXions Consortium, an organization established in Bristol in 2016 and seeks power, not just presence, but substantive representation in city affairs so that the needs of African heritage communities are met. And so that body also has an element of its work, a large amount of its work, focused on reparatory justice, and is working with communities to build a localized contribution, the Bristol reparations plan that we call Pempanzie Mpango. For your Kiswahili speakers in Mpango, you know his plan. Pempanzie in the Akan language of tree means to knit and sew together in readiness. So it's about being prepared for our repair and to participate in that. So Brother Madu is also a sound man, a father, a promoter and a grandfather. And so he's made his way through the blizzard like our guests from London today, who we're grateful also to have made it. Sister Esther Stanford-Xosei is a Pan-Africanist, jurist consult, reparationist and community advocate, specializing in reparations, lawmaking, policy development and movement building under the auspices of the Pan-Afrikan Reparations Coalition in Europe, otherwise known as PARCO, and the Stop the Mangamizi We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign, and the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations, otherwise known as INOSA. And joining her is Kobina Amokwandoh, and he is an organizer, a reparationist campaigner, campaigning for planet repairs through local community-led action learning and other activities. He is a coordinator and co-claimant for the Global Majority versus the UK government campaign, a movement dedicated to opposing colonialism. He's a key mobilizer of youth in the Global African Reparations Forum of London, which is kind of a sister organization of the Afrikan ConneXions Consortium. So both the Mangamizi Educational Trust, which is the educational arm of the Stop the Mangamizi campaign, and GARFOL provide the secretariat for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on African Reparations, or the APGAR, which is chaired by Bel Ribeiro Ade MP for Streatham. It is the work of the Stop the Mangamizi campaign in authoring alongside cross-party politicians and the Afrikan ConneXions Consortium that has led to the passing of the Atonement and Reparations motion in Bristol in 2021, and earlier in 2020 by full councils in Islington and Lambeth, which also had localized contributions from that context. So welcome to you both. And in talking about reparations today and the role of testimony, I think it's important that we kind of clear the deck in terms of our understanding of this word reparations. So at least we can have a shared understanding, because in the work that these colleagues do, these brothers and sisters, there's a lot of conceptualizations in African languages, and also conceptualizations using English language too. So let's be clear, Kobina, if you could start by defining reparations for us, please.
Defining reparations?
Yes, please, very quickly.
No, okay, thank you. This is an important one because I think in particular reparations is contested. Right now we're seeing a lot of definitions of reparations which are insisting that it's about compensation, or it's about losses and damages, or some other thing that is going to limit what we're actually entitled to as a people. And so I start there because it's already been said by many of our ancestors before that who's going to pay reparations for our souls, right? And reparations, to my understanding of the work that we do, is about the reclamation of full sovereignty of our peoplehood, which means the rebuilding of the power of our peoples, which requires the rebuilding of our institutions to reclaim back the full sovereignty that we as an African people have lost. And that is reparatory justice, that is what reparations mean.
Okay, so you're talking about reparations in a very holistic sense. So part of that is what is defined under international law in terms of those 5 principles. Sister Esther, if you could also explain to us what those principles are and how you have conceptualized this thing around planet repairs and what that means.
Sure. Hi, greetings everyone. So under international law, which is an interesting term to use because there's really no such thing as international law, but there is models of law that have been globalized by dominant groups, let's say. But anyhow, the notion of international law that is recognized by organizations such as the United Nations, there is the basic guidelines and principles on a right to a remedy and reparation. And this recognizes that reparations is a holistic remedy to redress injustice, group-based injustice often. And it begins with what's known as a cessation of violations and assurances, which means stopping the harm, basically. Whatever injustices are happening, and one of the ones that we can all relate to is anti-black racism, say, and its specific form of anti-African prejudice and discrimination, which is known as Afrophobia, that the United Nations is kind of struggling to recognize at this time. So the struggle continues on that. So it means ending, a world without any type of racism. That would be a stopping of the harm as a process, really. And then you have to have measures of restitution, which is really to put a people or a group back in the position they would have been in, but for enslavement, colonialism, neo-colonialism, and all the kind of whole catalogues of violations that we experience as collectives. And restitution also includes notions such as a return to our homeland or a right to a citizenship, a Pan-African citizenship. This process of return or going back to Africa is one of the oldest notions of reparations for people of African origin who were kidnapped from our homelands. And so we've had from, the beginning of us being kidnapped, attempts to return home. So that's part of restitution. It also includes restituting resources that are being pillaged, resources stolen, property, all kinds of property, including land and other types of tangible property, as well as intangible property as well. So that's the restitution. And most people kind of go to compensation, which is really about putting an economic value on harm. But compensation should really serve the ends of restitution. Not by itself as a remedy, just get some money, but no, to be restituted to who we were and to be put back on that path of our story making, which we have been reduced to kind of being footnotes in the annals of the stories of those that have colonized us and continue to benefit from that colonization. And so the compensation also is about, it's not just about money, but it is about putting an economic value on harm. And that harm might look like trade injustice today, for instance, yeah? What the cost of that, the cost of employment discrimination, racism in the workplace, when you're working with a comparator that might be racialized as white or another group, and you're being paid less, the difference in value, for instance. Then there's this notion of rehabilitation, which is really speaking to that desire for healing within communities, rebuilding and strengthening the agency and the power and the capacity of communities to do for themselves. It also includes measures of access to justice and sort of resourcing psychosocial therapeutic interventions and all kinds of group therapies that can rid ourselves of intergenerational Stockholm syndrome and, you know, all kinds of maladies that we have internalized. Then there's the notion of satisfaction, which is known as symbolic reparation, and that speaks to pulling down the Statue of Colston, you know, for instance, which Bristol is famous for, people in Bristol are famous. That's one example, but changing the curriculum, changing street names, you know, telling a different narrative about who we are and our contribution to world civilization and culture and heritage. As opposed to just being classified and defamed as being slaves or descendants of slaves, for instance.
And that satisfaction also speaks to us having a sense of what it means to be repaired.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it might also include measures of holding perpetrators to account. Yeah? And finally, but the most important one for me anyway, is the guarantees of non-repetition, which is what gets really kind of underemphasized in African people's repair process. But Jewish people had this notion of guarantees of non-repetition with this statement, never again, would the Jewish Holocaust happen, and that's why they established a nation state, a powerful nation state called the State of Israel, which I think we would all agree is quite powerful today, whatever people's politics on Israel, Palestine is. So that guarantees of non-repetition, which for us, we identify as building a Pan-African Union of communities known as Ma'at Ubuntu Man, which is basically a Pan-African sort of super state, but not based on the European Westphalian models of statehood, but it's about unifying communities based on African conceptualizations of what it means to live in a good society. So one of the highest ethical ideals that our ancestors have been championing and has kind of continued through the generations is Ma'at, from the African peoples of Kemet, otherwise known as Egypt, okay? So that's Ma'at Ubuntu Man. And this notion of Ma'at Ubuntu Man really cannot exist outside of a repaired world, which is known as Ubuntu Dunia, which is where we catalyze all other people's repair struggles to change the world so that whatever has happened to us never ever happens again. That is the holistic notion of reparations, right? And the Planet Repairs, is a holistic conceptualization that has come out of our organizing, particularly in the Pan-Afrikan Reparations Coalition in Europe, and also embraced by the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, that speaks to the fact that the harm against us, the harms of colonization, continued coloniality, imperialism, neo-colonialism, etc., didn't just impact us as human beings and as African people, people of African ancestry and heritage, but also impacted our relationship with our Earth Mother, that which sustains all our lives. That was part of the colonization process. So the Planet Repairs really speaks to this nexus of reparatory justice and everything within that, environmental justice, but also cognitive justice, because a big part of the harm was killing our knowledge systems of what it means to live, to be human, to also live and recognize other life forms as one whole. Sure.
There's another phrase I think we haven't, thank you for that, come to introduce yet in terms of the Ma'angami. We talked about it in terms of the name of a campaign. Brother Madu, in terms of what your understanding is of the word, and to also bring this whole notion of testimony in it, because we need to be talking about the role of testimony in an evidential sense, and sometimes we don't understand what has happened to us and what is happening, and so for the remedies we seek actually are also being defined by other people. So we have this whole UK thing around equality, diversity and inclusion as some sort of goal. But when we understand what the Ma'angamizi means, we understand the limitations of this whole ED&I agenda. Brother Madu, talk to us about what you understand by the term Ma'angamizi.
I wanted to say ditto, but I can't say it. I never knew that word a long time ago, if I'm to be honest. It's not something I knew about a long time. And I've always been associated with the term Holocaust. So for some of us, when we talk about Holocaust, we were sort of comparing what we were led to believe Jews went through and Africans went through the same. And then suddenly I was introduced to the word, and it said to me that it's a continuing process. The Ma'angamizi speaks to things that are happening to us today, right? Which wouldn't be described as something historical. So if you talk about, some people associate the enslavement of Africans as something that happened without recognizing that there's things that still happen even as I speak. So for me, the Ma'angamizi speaks to that. It's about restoring, repairing, rehabilitating. It's about community, it's about the world. And
Yes.
it's about that. So that's what it is.
And so it is a continuum. It's something that is very present. It's a word that comes from the Kiswahili language and popularized by Malala Karenga, who took the word because he wanted to emphasize the intentionality of the harm. And that's very important for us to recognize, because some of us might have heard this term Maafa, which means great disaster in Kiswahili, but disasters happen in many forms, from car pileups to floods and tsunamis and things like this. So we needed something that spoke to an African Holocaust in a particular way, and so the Ma'angamizi is the term that we're using to more accurately describe that. So just going to this whole thing around testimony, Brother Madu, when you lost your son, many decades ago now, as you say, we were not using that language in terms of how his passing came about. Do you then now locate what happened with your son within this experience of the Ma'angamizi?
Yes, because if you interpret it in the way I've just said, it would appear that it was just another incident between young people. If you understand the word, you will know it's not just that. It's an orchestrated system that enables young people to have what they call beef. And therefore, it comes in a way which you don't understand that word. You wouldn't see it as that. You just think it's criminality between young people. But it's not. It's actually something that I feel is set up and orchestrated to enable that kind of behavior. So at the time, I wouldn't interpret it in that way. Now I kind of see. And it is happening still. I mean, as I speak, I guarantee you, before the end of tomorrow, there'll be a beef of some sorts. There'll be a street incident of some sorts, because we see it every day, every single day. So yes, it is a word for enough that when it's used, and I've heard people comment on that, you know, it will be said and people say, stop trying to fool the word. It gets put down a lot. And I believe we need to find ways of encouraging people to have a better understanding of what it means, and not to see it as, oh, an African word that is new to you, that is used by you radicals, which some of us are old.
Okay, so in a moment we're going to watch a short video called I Am Witness, but I would just like Kobina to talk about the role of testimony in what we call the international social movement for African reparations, and then after we watch the video we can hear a bit more about how I Am Witness manifests from Sister Esther.
Yeah, okay. So testimony is what we're all here to do today. And at least before we get into some of the practicalities, I want to just introduce the fact that testimony is really a question of power. And if we're just talking for talking's sake, we're wasting our time. And we're also therefore not giving testimony to what the actual situation that we find ourselves in is. Testimony comes from the word that means from it's like Latin, comes from the word that means from testis, which means witness. And so when you're giving testimony, you're actually giving evidence of what is being experienced, of what you're seeing. And so it has weight, not just in the courts of their laws and their systems, but it has weight in the courts that we are yet to build, where we give evidence of what we are trying to do and what we know we're experiencing as a community. So testimony is really about that truth-telling process, and the fact that part of our reparations journey, which is a revolutionary, liberatory one, we're called to be nothing but truth-tellers and to seek truth in everything that we do. And that's also then a question about what we're challenged to do, because I'd venture to say later on at least, that testimony isn't just about talk. Because if you're going to live the evidence and be a witness to what you're experiencing, and you embody that, then your testimony has to come in how you act and how you move. So testimony is also really about practice and praxis. And what are we really on when we're aware of the situation that we're in? Now, in the context of today's conversation, that will feature into the importance of why we're here and gathered and what we can then be doing when we leave this place, and what is the value of testimony so that we can actually be building power and we don't leave these as isolated conversations.
Thank you. So, by way of introduction to what we're going to be talking about next, which is what role does testimony play in the international social movement for African reparations, otherwise known as the ISMA for short. We're just going to watch a short video and then we're going to build on that with Sister Esther. I Am Witness. Filmed at Kumba in June 2020, I believe, by Joan of London. Sister Esther, the role of testimony, where does it feature in this movement and the strategy and the policy aspects that we're trying to build here?
Thank you. So the video that you've just seen is a promotional video for the Stop the Maangamizi campaign that I'm a coordinator general of. That has this particular specific campaign around witness statements. So this is not just about telling our stories of the Maangamizi and its continuing impact. We really devised this specific campaign to aid our holistic repair process, and one of the key strategic goals that we are advocating as part of the international social movement for African reparations here in the UK, which is to establish what's called an administrative reparations mechanism, known as the All-Party Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry for Truth and Reparatory Justice, otherwise known as the APSITAJ by acronym. Now, in terms of most people's repair processes, there are three main ways that reparations policies, remedies, settlements occur. So one is like direct revolution, and one example of that is the Haitian Revolution. Yeah, for instance, that's where people literally take what is owed to them, right? So I'm not sure if we're going to be able to replicate the actual conditions for the Haitian Revolution again today, especially given what's happening in Haiti and the fact that it's under occupation. So we're not parking that one, but we're using that as a guide to say that is one way, you know, if a struggle evolves to a particular level. Yeah, there is still a need for revolutionary struggle. The most other ways, however, in so-called liberal democracies, as societies like Britain, as it, you know, the people that rule this society like to call it, are through lawsuits, court actions, which often take years and years and years and years, and they're always very partial victories, even if one succeeds. And a lot of the time, they don't succeed because the system of law is used to reinforce kind of conquest and, you know, to ensure that people who have benefited from enslaved labor through the generations hold on to that ill-gotten wealth, okay? So there was a lawsuit in this country actually in 2003 that was initiated by the Black Quest for Justice campaign that was seeking to hold Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, as she was alive at the time, accountable for crimes against humanity, against people of African heritage worldwide as a result of the British Empire and the fact that Britain's official involvement in the kidnapping and trafficking of African people began, you know, in the 1600s. So that kind of didn't work because you cannot actually sue the Crown for crimes against humanity, yeah? And there hasn't been a successful case since the mid-1600s in the UK. And then the other more common mechanism that most people around the world who have any type of repair kind of process going on is like through truth commissions or commissions of inquiry. So the APSITAJ, the All-Party Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry for Truth and Reparatory Justice, is like a combination between a truth commission and a commission of inquiry. It's a specific kind of bespoke model that some of us, especially in the Pan-Afrikan Reparations Coalition in Europe, have been championing since the early 2000s. And there's a parallel process happening in the USA right now, which is known as HR 40, which is a Commission to Study Reparations Proposals for African Americans Act that took over 13 years to even kind of get debated. And it's still not been implemented into law. Now, given the fact that in between, say, the 1960s and now, there's been over about 100 such truth commissions, commissions of inquiries for different people all around the world, there's a lot of learning that we have around what works and what doesn't work. And what you often find is that there's no perfect model of a truth commission. One of the most famous ones was South Africa, but that's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but that had a lot of faults with it in that it, you know, sort of granted amnesty to perpetrators of apartheid, people like, you know, Dr. Bassoon, known as Dr. Death, people who were involved in, you know, literally extermination, germ warfare against trying to exterminate Black African people in South Africa, and they were never held accountable, and no one knows what has happened to that science or pseudoscience. And there was a lot of collaboration with the British state and sort of germ warfare factories and so forth, not only in South Africa, but here in the UK. Anyway, this is the model that we are championing here, the APSITAJ. And we've tried to learn from the good aspects of some of previous commissions of inquiries and truth commissions in terms of giving testimony, giving voice, amplifying voice, hearing from survivors and resistors of the Maangamizi in its different phases, and looking at how we utilize that for evidentiary purposes. And that's really important because the British government line, and it's kind of similar to other European governments, is that the British state is not responsible for slavery that happened hundreds of years ago. That's the standard response. We didn't do it, it's not us, we cannot be held legally accountable. And slavery's ended and it's all good now because we get on really good, you know, with the African and Caribbean nations, and you've got lots of sports players and personalities on the TV and MBEs and OBEs, and you know, you're all doing all right, like. So the idea of this testimony is really to disrupt that, you know, insane notion that we're all doing all right, because it's really not seen. We're not seen as victims. Victims is not a nice word. No one wants to think of themselves as a victim. But in law processes and international law, to be recognized as a victim means that something's happened to you and you therefore have a right to a remedy and reparation because you've suffered harm, you know, either as an individual or a collective. So that's the point of this program, I Am Witness, which we developed, you know, as I said, we've been pushing this apsitage since around 2003. And that was when we initiated the Black Quest for Justice legal action. And we were told that, yeah, you can't sue Queen Elizabeth, but if there's evidence of continuing crimes against humanity and war crimes and genocide and such, go and report it to your local police station.
So there's...
That's what we were told
Yes.
by the Attorney General, you know, that we should just go and report it to the local coppers, like, you know.
So there's a role for testimony in perpetrator, in states and institutional facing challenges around reparative justice. There's also things that involve the community in self-determined organisation and their own kind of spaces that you call people's tribunals.
Yes, so the idea of the I Am Witness project, which was first co-initiated as a partnership between Joan London, who is the filmmaker, but also the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, was to be able to have like a dual purpose, because we have the Stop the Maangamizi petition that has these two kind of milestones, one being the APSITAJ, the All-Party Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry for Truth and Reparatory Justice. But the other is that that process would also lead to creating new legal mechanisms. So for instance, Jewish people, you know, seeking remedies didn't go to Nazi courts to hold them to account. That was just foolish. So what they created were new legal mechanisms called the Nuremberg Tribunal, where a lot of the kind of modern day most serious crimes of international law, that's where they were really kind of formalized. Crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, crimes of aggression, and now the fifth crime that is going through the process of being recognized is the crime of ecocide, yeah? And so what we're using this process to do is to also create testimony to be heard at our version of a new tribunal that is known as the People's International Tribunal for Global Justice in English, and the African term is the Ubuntu Gotla. Now the Gotlas are kind of communocratic spaces for hearing grievances in Botswana, just like we have, you know, African forms of kind of legal institutions. So we're talking about legal pluralism, where we're taking the best of ourselves to look at what would be a justice process for us. And a big part of it is being able to not only speak to what has happened, but to have that recognized, that we are survivors and resistors of the Maangamizi, which in Kiswahili speaks to an intentional destruction of a people. And when some of us use terms like genocide, I remember I used to be on the board of Anti-Slavery International that looks at issues of contemporary enslavement. And when I started using that terminology of genocide in the early 2000s, I was being told, oh, come on, you know, what, you haven't gone through a genocide, that's a bit strong, isn't it? But actually, the coiner of the term genocide, Raphael Lemkin, Dr. Raphael Lemkin, he was interested in how you destroy groups. Of course, he studied Jewish people. He was Jewish himself, Polish Jewish, but he studied other groups. And there's a really great quote from him. Genocide has two phases. One, the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group. The other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. So even though there's a specific definition in the 1948 Genocide Convention, Raphael Lemkin's work spoke to destroying a group doesn't mean just physically exterminating them. The group can still exist, but if you destroy their national culture, their patterns of life, their institutions of governance, of family, of economics, of everything that, you know, a people make sense of themselves and continues themselves. So the people will remain, but they are not themselves. And then when they get colonized and taken over by a more dominant group, through institutions, through military and all of that, through the education, through religious organizations, what you have is the genocide and the destruction of that group, because it is no longer able to replicate itself, which is a right of all peoples, to replicate themselves, to replicate their culture, to pass on their culture and their values to their descendants as well.
Okay, if I could come in here and kind of move us along in terms of our understanding about what reparations is. We've also talked about the role of testimony, which we're going to come back to. One of the themes that has been flowing, marbled through this whole museum events is this thing around digitization. And Kobina, I just want to ask you about that, because we're not alone. We don't talk about reparatory justice in the context of the land where our feet lie. Mm-hmm. How important it is for testimony to be shared globally, and what role can digitization play in that process, and is it a good thing?
Okay. So there's a lot to unpack there.
Yes.
But I think the starting point for this question is to remind ourselves about what we've just been talking about.
Yes.
In terms of reparations and what we're repairing. So if we as a people are facing a genocide, and if we acknowledge that in this room, then we have to first really recover our peoplehood. And so this question of testimony automatically doesn't work if the pattern of our peoplehood that is being attacked is our ability to recognize that we're part of a family 1.4 billion people strong. So if we're sat in this room and then we start to journey on this question of, oh, we're going to go and do our reparations work now, oh yeah, I get it now, and ignore the fact that we are, in this country, 4% of the UK population, and in terms of the global African family, very insignificant, then we are partaking in our own genocide by continuing to allow that disruption to have its impact on even where we're going in the future. So to your question and to the direction that we're taking, this testimony is also about us hearing each other's stories as a process of recovering who we are and what we have lost. In practical terms, if someone chopped off your arm and then you start paying attention to right hand and to think about, my right hand hurts now, you just forget about your left arm, you're not going anywhere. And one of the reasons why this is so important in terms of the tactical question of what is we're getting to here, and then how do we then situate digitization, is I'm trying to lay the background so we can deal with the meat of this question, is when the question comes about, okay, we hear you, you've got grievances as a people, what do you want to do about it? And we're now not paying attention to our right arm, our left leg, our right ear, and they start coming to suggest, okay, this is what you need to do about it, or we think that we have the authority to answer that question on our own. Then you have a situation where they can rob Peter, aka left leg, to pay Paul, right arm, and think we're going to be okay with it. Now this is the crucial time we find ourselves right now as a people, and it means that this rediscovering journey, this repair journey, includes paying, first of all, witness to ourselves. Witness to ourselves, reminding ourselves who we are. And that's a form of testimony that doesn't just mean speaking out, it means speaking to, speaking with, hearing each other's voices, rediscovering our languages so that we can make sense of this big picture that we've lost. And so digitization and this question of decolonizing museums and all this sort of stuff only makes sense if you start to address this from a question of us being a global African family. Because there's huge infrastructural problems that immediately come up. Not even in this country does everyone have a laptop or access to Wi-Fi or data. So if we if that becomes all we're talking about when we talk about testimony, then we've lost half of the people in the room. If we are talking about decolonizing museums and digitization, and we aren't thinking about where these artifacts and this information came from, and we're not supporting there to be access between us and these bridges, then again, we're not even touching on testimony or building the power of this people's tribunal that we're talking about. So digitization is important because we have to recognize, okay, we're here now and there's contradictions in this battle that we're in. And here right now, we have to make use of the fact that it's very easy to find out what's happening around the world in a way that it wasn't before. So when Marcus Mosiah Garvey was able to speak to that global African family and start to build bridges across the world, and we here who have access to Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and are busy scrolling on all types of... Come on, let's be real with ourselves about what we waste our time doing, really and truly. What we were watching on the way on the journey into this meeting today. Think really and truly. And if at best we're going to go and pay attention to BBC News that they're going to tell us. So the question of digitization is a tactical question. Yes, we must use the chances we have to make these gains. But let's make that decision alongside the rest of our people and support those connections to be really strong. And also make sure that when they cut off the internet, because they might just do that too, that we've got other mechanisms in place by then. So the practice of digitization can only come from a community that is thinking about organization. A community that is organized about the situation we face ourselves with. So when we listen to these testimonies, these should be questions about, they're not just, I heard it, really, really cool what you just had to say. It's like, okay, what am I doing next? What are we doing next? And if we plan those together, then yes, digitization plays a huge opportunity to us to build the type of platforms that reconnect the African family as part of our repair. Now that task has to be taken up by the people, by coordinated groups of people from our families all around the world. People have to be taking that up. And especially to the younger people in this audience, like these are the concrete challenges that we're talking about when we say digitization, what we can be doing with it, what our young people should be thinking about doing with it, and how we can find each other across all of these different parts and answer these questions. But it's not straightforward. It has its pros and its
yes, risks and opportunities. And I was just wanting to ask Brother Madu, from just looking at it from a localized perspective, if you feel in your observations of our communities in Bristol, if they see themselves as part of a global family, and what work the Afrikan ConneXions Consortium are involved in to make those connections, those global connections around reparatory justice.
Sometimes you approach a question from being real. And part of me being real, I sit here thinking, so much things we're not doing yet. You know, you feel like you've been doing a lot for a long time. That when you hear some things that are happening, you realize, well, we're going to start. We haven't even budged. And I recently remember saying to Rosina, who was sitting there, I never really seriously thought about planet, justice, and earth. All that never come into it. It just started to come into it recently. So the question you ask is a real one. Yes, there's an ACC that's attempting to do some things locally, I wouldn't begin to even think that we've started to understand what's happening locally. There's a lot of stuff happening outside that world, I know. So sometimes we're trapped in our little environment, and we might get something happening out. Yeah, we reached there, but we haven't. As an organization, I'm reading some of the things that we aspire to do. And if we can get that support, and it works, it talks about, for example, taking responsibility for our own repairs through community organizations and actions. You sometimes get caught up into thinking you're on a journey and your journey is taking you somewhere, but sometimes community get left behind. It talks about planning in the interest of the group, not the individual. Sometimes we like to be showcased as knowledgeable and know things, and forget that this has to embrace family and community as well. And it talks about being part of a global movement. As somebody who's been around for a while, doing some things for a while, I'll be the first to confess that I don't think we have even touched on understanding what's happening globally. I would be honest in saying that, and that's why part of the role of ACC is to start that dialogue. So even being here today, to hear some of the things I've heard, made me realize that there's a whole heap of work to be done. If I'm to be lots of work, and lots of people are happy and satisfied that we're in a new kind of world. And it's very hard sometimes when you get told that you radicals that have been doing what you've been doing for all these years, what difference has it made? You get these kinds of questions thrown at you. And I suppose for me, sitting and listening to some of the things that's been said, which we don't often hear, makes me realize that things are happening. But yes, we have a long way to go. But seeing people coming just here to hear some of what we hear today and knowing what I do know now tells me that it's not something we can give up on. We just need to carry on.
Thank you. I want to come back to Kobina and to be talking about this principle of Ubuntu and give me the opportunity to introduce our next clip, which is about I Am Witness in Ghana. So if you would, and then we can return to the conversation after that point and explore some more about cognitive justice and how that relates to our overarching reparatory justice goals. That's a cue for you to introduce the video.
Okay.
Yes.
So we watched the first introductory video about the I Am Witness campaign, and that was introduced to us in the Global Majority Versus campaign through working with the Stop the Monk Easy Recharge Genocide Ecocide campaign about the importance of this truth telling that we're not doing. And immediately it became a question of, okay, how are we going to find these truths and build the power of our people internationally to tell these truths? And that campaign has been about taking the UK government to court for its human rights violations around the world, but where in this country you have the so-called right to family life, Article 8. And that family is obviously the rest of our family back home. So if we aren't paying attention there, how do we address how badly our rights are being violated in the present day? And so we have a testimony from young brother Yao from Ghana, West Africa, who was, again, very bravely speaking on the actual experience of African peoples, both now, in a very live testimony sense. And it was just for the context, right? This is speaking up and speaking and projecting your voice as a young African brother, a young cadre of ours, who, when you're speaking a truth like this, you're speaking it against the global might of imperialism. This isn't just some small thing. So it's also for us to pay attention with the due respect for where young people are moving, agitating, and actually starting to wake up in our continent, in our home. So again, if we're talking about testimony when we do it, and we give evidence and we actually start to speak with each other, if you were looking on BBC or whatever they put in front of us, these are not the voices of young Africans that are being put in front of us. Done in such a way that we don't even know the truth, where we think we're connecting back home with the reality that our people are experiencing as they feel it when they can speak in their truth. Now that only happens if we build those bridges so that when we're giving evidence and sharing with each other, we can empower each other to hear each other's truths as they are and recognize that when we talk about repair, these are practical things. The conditions of schools back home, the fact that young people are still being taught to learn English and sound. I remember I was speaking to a sister and she said, I want to speak like you do. And I was like, this is confusing because I'm trying to be like you. I'm trying to reconnect with what I've lost. And you're hearing the way I speak, which is the Queen's English, which I got from, studying in their universities. And we have to reconcile with these are the contradictions that we're talking about. When we're talking about one of these aspects of planet repairs, which is cognitive justice, which is reclaiming how we think, reclaiming who we, it's deep, language. We're thinking in a foreign language, so we can't frame even these questions of the justice that we need. So no wonder why on the streets the man them are squabbling about crumbs, because we don't know that we're owed the trillions that are taken by 100 companies on the stock exchange every year. We don't know that. And so we don't think about the importance of all of these things. So the power of this is actually about really challenging us, rubbing us raw to start moving correctly, and knowing that every breath, every step we take here in this country especially, we're doing that on our people's time. We're doing it at their expense. So can we justify any types of foolishness when literally time is being stolen from the motherland to be brought here, and for us to do what with it?
Sister Esther, the young man talked about pouring libation, and it's something that we do to honor our ancestors. These are the same ancestors, many of whom they have paid with their life for their testimony. So the phrase that came into my mind was around this thing, you talked about Haiti earlier, liberty or death. Speak to us about that, because I think we have, and Yao said it himself, been socialized into this position of fear.
Well, I think hearing testimonies of our people globally expose us to the reality of the different ways in which the Mangamizi is still impacting on them, on what they have to do. So it's not just about what happened to our foreparents and ancestors, but it's about the continuum of that in our own lineages, yeah? And how that violence, every kind of violence, structural, epistemic, spatial violence, the direct kind of interpersonal violence as well, how we're resisting that, but also seeking to still restore ourselves and rebuild ourselves. And when we hear these testimonies, rather than feeling fearful, we should feel, and many of us do feel, actually very empowered and inspired, because we know that this myth that somehow they didn't resist, they didn't fight back, people are happy with their circumstances, they're accepting the world order as it is, we know that that's not true. And we then know through connecting, through testimony, that we are not alone. Yeah, and that there are, when you hear this cacophony of voices globally, and also locally, because there are many of our people from all around the world who are living here or whatever, for whatever reason, find themselves in the UK. And that continues. And the beauty of how we as reparationists are using this testimony is also to wake ourselves up. Yes? Yeah. To wake ourselves up, because we all know our part of the story and the journey, and maybe our bits, parts of our family, immediate family. But we don't know the story of many of those that we've been disconnected from, that we may not even know that we have these connections, because that was part of it, the dismembering of peoples. yeah, and giving us new identities and us adopting new identities and forgetting who we were and who we are and who we must still become. Yeah, so that's the power of this for me. And the work that we're doing is catalyzing resistance today to the Maangamizi in its current phase of neo-colonialism and imperialism, so that we can continue that path of transformation and reparatory justice change making along the lines of Ma'at, Ubuntu, yeah? Along the lines of Ubuntu Dunia, this multipolar world of global justice for all, not along the lines of what our colonizers have done and how they sought to kind of divide and rule everybody and keep everybody in a state of fear, but a kind of regenerative. And that's the importance also for me of the cognitive justice, because one of the ancient notions of repair is this verb sarujta, that has also been popularized and taught to us by Professor Malena Karenga. And really, in short, it speaks to this notion of the process and practice of the repair and renewal and transformation of a people who are in the process and practice of transforming the world. That is the ancient notion of Sarujta. And it speaks to not only transforming ourselves, but leaving the world and making it much more beneficial than what we've inherited it. And there are similar conceptualizations of this transformation that other peoples hold. So for instance, there's this notion of tikkun olam that comes out of the Hebraic thought that means a similar thing, like a kind of restoration of the world. So that global justice dimension of the repair, and it's only through these kinds of testimony that we can hear that. And actually, thankfully, to the Global Majority Versus campaign that Kobina here is part of, and then Prela, which you're going to go on to talk about, this work, we are also catalyzing the narratives of other peoples who've been colonized by some of the same people that we've been colonized by, right? And they are doing a similar thing. So that this world remaking process that our testimony is really illuminating is happening now. Reparations is a world remaking project, and that is happening now. The Ma'at Ubuntu man is emerging, because we have structures like Ma'at Ubuntu Mitau Gafrik in Ghana, where you have these liberated territories in West Africa that we as Africans in the diaspora, we're reconnecting, we're getting back on the land, we're going, we're taking that difficult step of getting to know each other again. You imagine we've been separated centuries. We can't even speak the same language a lot of the time. We've come with our airs and graces and we've got our ways and people, and it might seem strange, but doing that rememberment, yeah, is part of what this testimony is enabling. And there's a really great quote here that I think is relevant from James Baldwin. The victim who is able to articulate the situation of the victim has ceased to be a victim. He or she has become a threat. We are a threat when we begin unifying across all these linguistic and cultural and spiritual and ideological and all this ism and schism that separates us. But that is the power of these testimonies, because even if we don't speak the language, we feel the spirit and we can tune into that spirit of our people and that universal consciousness that connects all of us.
Thank you. And to connect to that, because you mentioned Prela, and which I want to invite into the conversation, because if we're talking about testimony, we're talking about the role of testimony in the reparatory justice process, as part of also movement building strategy. We have Brother Madu here, and you're owner of a sound system, you're a broadcaster, you have prime airtime. So I want to speak to you all, and starting with yourself, around the role of media and reparatory justice in relation to media policy. And within that, when I speak with you, Kobina, if you can bring Prela and Ubuntu Dunia into the conversation at that point. But are we using what we have, and how should it effectively, and how could we improve on our access to media and building structures which actually speaks into the Dennis Brown track that we played at the beginning? What about the half that's never been told?
Why may I exit the difficulty? I'm answering in a real way. So, something that happened. I recently came up from Africa. One of the things that always concerns me is we do trips to Gambia, and when we take people from here, they never go with a different mindset than the British mindset. Everything is compared. So you keep after mind, you're not in damn England. If you want to stay in England, stay. Don't come on any more trips with me. Right? So I begin to realize that yes, one of the things that we certainly can't do in answer to the question is give up on using these formats. Because if we do that, simple as it may seem and sound, I am feeling fairly confident in some of the things that we're doing now with the radio. Because it at the moment, to be fair, most of us who are involved with any form of information dissemination, empowering, we're sort of coming from the same wavelength in terms of understanding the mission of the radio. And I think that was the problem before. If you are involved with nation building or reparation of any kind, everyone has to at least have an understanding of where you're coming from. So I believe at the moment, some of us who are involved with the radio, which is a powerful way of sending across information, are coming from that similar focus. And therefore, using the medium of sound and radio, you have to be brave, in a sense, if I use that word. Because if I'm in the middle of a dance, I'll stop it and say anything I think I need to say. Especially if it's on my sound, because you can't tell me I can't do that. So I do it. I will stop in the middle of a dance and I'll say, anybody know Mangamese and what it means? You better go and learn. So yes, we are individually in positions where we have resources that can enable us to engage. I think you, the person, has a lot to do it as well. And for me personally, I can speak for me. I have been involved in dabbling with community for a long time. Somewhere, prisons, schools, you name it. So if you get to a stage where you have some degree of respect and you give some back, people will listen. And as I said, nobody else can take the risk of doing what I do in a dance. Nobody else can do that. That's very difficult to do if you're not me. So yes, and I believe I am seeing where the radio, particularly the radio, is being listened to, because I take my reference from the pub. Whenever I go to the radio, the next day I'm in the pub, because I want to hear what pub people think. Funny enough, they say a lot, and they mean a lot, and I was involved in a conversation last night, which is very interesting. The guy said, well, we are supposed to Senegal, because I'm African, so we're not business more England. And that sounded a bit, because coming from him, that was something to so I believe when people hear things in a language that they can relate to, it enables them to have conversations. And on any given week, at least twice per week, I walk into that pub and I'll be confronted with something you said, you in particular. Because they keep saying, you're a sister in there, the radical one. And the guy said, I don't agree with you. She said, well, you know, me find myself listening every week. He's not agreeing, but he listens every week. And I said, so you listen to the show? She said, yeah, I can't miss it. That tells me something, right? And I believe because he's in that environment, he finds it difficult to accept that he's actually on a learning path. So we can't give up. We have to continue to use these mediums to do what we're setting out to do. Because every time I learn something, and I don't just learn it from intellects, as we might be deemed. You get it from the ordinary person who sometimes tell you something that you didn't think about. So we just have to keep doing it.
Yeah, and I think at this point I'd like to recognise Ecom Media, otherwise known as Pat Hart, Sherry Eugene, because when we were trying to find a filmmaker to make a program around reparatory justice where we told our story, we controlled the script, we controlled the edit, and so on, people were impressed in Bristol that looked just like us, and they weren't interested. And they ended up making this film that went out on, was it We Are Bristol? What's the channel?
Yeah, Bristol. Made in Bristol.
Made in Bristol, thank you. And was syndicated and so on. And BRB Supermarket was the other sponsor of that. And so, you know, at that time it may have seen a bit of a risk, but you know, Ecom Media personally invested, BRB personally invested, and I want to acknowledge them and appreciate them for what they did that no other filmmaker was prepared to do some 4 or 5 years ago. Kobina, the role of media, the right to tell our own stories in our own time, in our own way. Key to reparatory justice, to be controlling our own media.
Is this a long bit or a short bit?
That's a short bit.
Okay.
Because we do want to take some questions and your response, if it could be short as well, sis.
Oh.
Because there are questions that perhaps people may want to ask, and we are running out of time.
Can I do a medium bit, not a short?
Yes. Okay.
Okay. Because yeah. So short answer, yes.
Yes.
Media is essential. The medium answer is also a bit about like, okay, how do we extend this into the practicalities of you know, let's talk practically. Let's talk about revolution, right? We down for this? Now that means one thing that we've been trying to do about this question of decolonizing everything, because everything needs to be decolonized, was launching of the Planet Repairs Action Learning Education Revolution, aka PRALA. Linktree/PRALA. But this was a question of, and it's going to come into this question of media, because like we said earlier right at the beginning, testimony can't just be what we say. Testimony has to be, do we act as witnesses of a crime against our humanity? Do we wake up and act that way? And do we move that way? And so it can't just be that when we even talk about media is really just like modes of communication, that we're not talking about everything from the singing to the dancing. And I'm glad you mentioned the sound system and the importance of recovering these important institutions of our communities. And I say that because, if I can do the medium bit,
Sure.
who here hails from Jamaica? So a couple people hail from Jamaica, right? Africans who come from Jamaica. Now, who from those same people who had their hands up have heard of the Akompong Maroons? Okay, solid. So we also all know that they've got a Supreme Court case on the 9th of December. Okay, good. I mean, include on crowd, but it's important, right? Because these things are live acts of testimony being given by freedom-fighting communities of resistance, who we have now today, not the black and white pictures of Lumumba, right now today, who are challenging the Jamaican neo-colonial state and Britain and the history of coloniality by saying we have the right to be a sovereign peoples. And that case is on the 9th, and that's something these are the live examples that we can tune into, we should be supporting. And these are things that we've started to make sure that we incorporate into all of our work. And this has been a question that the Planet Repairs Action Learning Education Revolution, which is an organized way that we can start really systematically organizing and coordinating our responses to our global family struggle, from intergenerational learning, from young to old, to schools, to young people, to all of that, and you can sign up to it, means that we all have a role to play in what our medium is. That's why I'm not going to treat media as this, just a shiny TV. I'm going to say, if you're a politician, then you could be forming a group around, okay, how are we going to decolonize this and bring people into that conversation who want to do that work? And in doing that, that starts to become the basis of an institutional pillar of what we are calling the Sankofa Pan-African Community Local Educational Complex. Because all of these questions about testimony, they require our own institutions from which we educate ourselves and then we do something about it. And that's why the second bit of PRALA, the PR, the AL, is action learning. Because we have this in our cosmovisions, in our African cosmovisions, knowledge isn't an idea, it's not a thing plucked out of the sky. It's embodied, it's practical. And so we have to action learn what comes out of these conversations, what comes out of these different spaces that we occupy, that we need to be organizing around. And this is how we define an educational revolution, which means that how are we going to address, for instance, that Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, our young people are in schools that are still teaching the same old criminality and pumping out thousands of people tuned into the wrong wavelength. What are we doing about that?
It's true.
That's a Prela conversation. That's something that parents, we can start to network and organize to do something about. What are the education policies of our community here to do something about that? That's education, but there's also, the drama, the edutainment. What is the structure of actually entertaining our families in ways that liberate ourselves? History in our community. Where are the spaces where people are coming to re-vindicate our histories and make sure that they're live and understood? Now, if any of these things tick a box, film, media, something you're interested in as an artist, how do we organize together and be the artists of the revolution, just like we had the Baldwins, just like we had the Miriam Makebas? This is what the time calls for. And in Prela, we're starting to give voice to these directions so that if this is ticked a box, let's talk after the conversation. But the rest of this medium bit is, we've been talking about testimony and we're talking about live struggles. And I started with the compound rooms because it should touch upon some of us here as a struggle that we can all be involved in supporting. Be it donations, being it raising attention to it, being sharing that story. That's a live fight. If we win that, that's a battle won somewhere. That's a place for us to be. Mali, who's paying attention to the situation in Mali. Now, Mali right now is undergoing a significant form of liberation struggle. I don't know if people saw videos of the French embassy in Mali being burnt down. The people have had enough of it. So when we feel tired and we're worried about, we ain't quite got it in us, there are forces there. That's a media question.
Yes.
And for that answer, we've been starting to develop a project called Ubuntu Dunia TV as a sort of form of communivision, where we start to coordinate our own media, and you can check it out on YouTube, on socials. But we also want to invite people to be able to start having our testimonies there and sharing it and discussing it really openly. The last one, Haiti. Again, we talk about Haiti and the role it's played in catalyzing our rebellion globally and changing the course of history. But Haiti right now currently has the UN and the US and the UK backing an armed invasion in Haiti. This is a pearl in the African family. Now, where was the response here when the UK government said that that's okay? Silent. Probably on Instagram, scrolling on some other sort of, right? Just to hit it home, Ghana, just the other day, the UK government in the Telegraph has just said it's moving a military base to Ghana. A lot of us have to go home to Ghana at Christmas time. But it's that time now where this government knows what time it is. And the question is, do we? We want to wear gold jewelry. Where's that gold coming from? And so these are the battles. This is like the real practicalities of what we have to do. And the last one.
The last of your medium point.
The last of the media point, because it is a media question, and it's linked into Prela, and I had to squeeze in a lot there, is the case of one of our sisters, Florence Mbahupa Handura. Now, Florence is currently battling against the UK Home Office, and on a case of staying in the UK. Now, this isn't just any case of our people who have been displaced having to find a place to be. Florence is also a freedom-fighting Over Herero indigenous woman who has been campaigning with the Over Herero Genocide Foundation. Now, the Over Herero and Nama people who live in modern-day Namibia were displaced and suffered the genocide that took about 130,000 lives. This was done by the German authorities under the German, I think it was called German Southwest Africa, was the territory that they controlled, which was given to them really by the British at the Berlin Conference of 1884. And since then, those Over Herero people who are displaced all around the world are still challenging the German authorities and the state of Namibia with the question of genocide, a real genocide that there's evidence for. Now, the German government's been trying to shift on this. Just last year, 1.1 billion euros was given over the course of 30 years for compensation for that violence. Now, if you do the maths, because we did the maths because we were so pissed off, if you do the maths, that's 8,000 euros per victim, per person massacred over the course of 30 years. So when Gil Scott Heron said, "Who will pay reparations on my soul?" and these criminals are still walking around putting up, literally blood money and saying that the value of an African knife is 8,000 euros. What can we do? And I'm saying there is something we can do, because Florence's case to stay in the UK, our argument now becomes from the Preda Law Study Action Group, which is one of the parts of the Preda Education Revolution, is we're now trying to see how can we teach law students to take up and support this case and make sure that we win Florence's case, and in doing so remind the British state that we know that you are complicit in these crimes, and the least you can do is let Florence stay so she can continue to do her freedom fighting work, which is all of our struggle to hold the German state and the state of Namibia to account and return the Ovaherero and Nama people to their indigenous sovereignty. So there are practical battles where we can start to remind ourselves who we are and see what we're doing, and they require the media and the sharing of what we're doing, so we can be sharing tactics with each other, so we can be sharing resources.
Thank you.
And there is so much to do in this, but this is there.
Okay. I want to take the final point on this whole thing around media, and then perhaps take a question or two, and then give you an opportunity to have some closing remarks, and also to let people know how they can reach you and interact and join the movement and make their very practical contributions.
So what I would say, just as a quick point around testimony, is what we're trying to do is influence hearts and minds across the UK, across Europe, across the diaspora, and also in our homelands. And media plays a key role there, because part of what we want to do is have these testimonies, these narratives, and these connections that real people are making with history and our continuum of the Mangamizi today, and for this to be shared through the different mediums of media and sound system and art and different ways of communicative expression. That is a key part of it. So if some of you might remember the settlement that the British government made with some Kenyans in 2013. Now, that is heralded as a reparations case. It really isn't, because it wasn't even as much as 8,000 euros. It was like £2,000, 2,000, maybe 400 that each Kenyan got as a result of torture in the 50s and 60s. Women had been violated, had all kinds of things stuck up them, vermin, men castrated, living, right? Elders now living in abject poverty. And this was heralded as a victory. Now, the reason why the British government settled was because when that case was going on at the High Court as to whether they would even have a right to sue the British government for acts of torture during Kenyan colonialism, the media, the corporate media, were reporting on the testimonies. And it was harrowing, because you had some of the responsible army officers alive today. Obviously, they're old people, right? But it was harrowing testimony. And rather than have more, it didn't go to full trial. It was a settlement which was the cop-out, and actually really injured the long-term case of all Kenyans, because all other cases have been blocked now, because they've said, oh, we've already settled. We've done a settlement that only benefited 5,000 odd people. There was a subsequent case where 20,000 people were represented. There's now a case at the UN around tea plantations. But anyway, the point I'm making is that testimony around injustices that living people could speak to was so threatening to this establishment that they was like, no, we're going to settle. We don't want this being reported anymore. And most people forgot about that story. That's when the Caribbean governments came out with, we're going to take up reparations. And they went to Lide, the same firm that represented the Kenyans, and ended up getting £6 million in compensation when the average Kenyan got 2,000 odd pounds. You get more than that for a whiplash injury in this country. That's what's happening. But again, speaking to how testimony itself is very, very powerful. So powerful that the powers that be will work to silence us, to not have those narratives come out. Now imagine all over the world, people are saying, yeah, but you did this to us too, and we've got the records, and this happened to my grandmother, and this is in my family, all around, and that's why they destroyed a lot of the records, because the British colonialists were meticulous record keepers. And they've been trying to bury that. So part of what we're doing with this I Am Witness is creating our own archives, digital archives. We're in, there's 3 phases to it. The first phase has been completed, which is, mapping what archives we have. And then we have to go to the final phases, which are about digitization. And the idea is that these would be archives, reparations archives that are UK-based, to document the actions of the international social movement for African reparations, because when you Google reparations in the UK, you don't really find much of the history, although the movement goes back to the mid-1700s in Britain, and every generation of people of African ancestry, however they self-defined, wherever they were trafficked from, in this country have been championing reparations, repair, restitution, yeah? And all other types of repair. And this is part of what we as activists are doing as part of our institution building that is about documenting and preserving our story, yeah? So that any researcher, any of our young people studying all the museums on museums, the exhibitions that we can host, that is coming from our history making within and beyond the British Isles, that speaks to global kind of realities.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, we're coming to a point
hear
now
from
I want to
people.
take questions. Just to say also that our panel are also invited back to Bristol if they're able to share with us on our 30th Kwanzaa celebration in Bristol, because we need to revisit these 3 themes that the Afrikan ConneXions Consortium are focused on in terms of building our reparations plan. This question of land, this question of education, and this question of cooperative economics as essential pillars of nation building processes. So I just want to put that out there and give you now the opportunity to ask a question and pray for a concise answer.
Don't look at me, look at this one.
They're not having it, they're not having
Look
it.
at this one.
Okay, has anyone got a question or a comment? Even? Brother Sean.
Yeah, thank you for the panel, really interesting discussions. Got 2 quick points. One might be quick to answer, hopefully the second might be. But, so one, Esther's point just there about the archives. And yeah, fantastic initiatives, and obviously it's needed. Just to say, if you don't know me, I'm Sean Sobers. I work at University of West England, media, cultural arts and research. So just think about the testimonies that you'll be looking forward to archive. Is it, is there a theme in terms of, is it about narratives and testimonies of our oppression, of our trauma, or are you also looking at everyday life, just how we live? Do you know what I mean? Even black joy, do you know what I mean? So what kind of categories will that fit, or is it particularly about, do you get that point? The second point I want to make, which may be a bigger answer, but so this time next week I'm going to be in Brussels, be invited to United Nations in Brussels to talk about some projects that we're involved in terms of creative arts, and to look at racism, anti-racism strategies, and some of the things I've been involved in. So in terms of speaking truth to power, what would you suggest I say to you?
I'll leave that one for you. All right? I'll leave that second one for you. Yeah, just...
Okay, which one would you like to take that? Okay.
Right, I'm going to take the first part, and Kobina here wants to do the second part. So in relation to... Right, so in relation to the first point, the I Am Witness, We Are Witness is specific to looking at harm that has been experienced, but then the second part of that is it's not just all about, oh, this happened to me and blah, blah, blah. What we're also interested in hearing is what reparations policies, projects, programs, services, and initiatives you are working on which require support. So that is then, what have we been doing? Because yes, we live with the harm. We're not just sitting there back, sitting back saying, oh, I've been harmed. It's also about we've had to build and survive and create community and create organization and create initiatives to try and address the harm. And that may very well include aspects of, Black joy or what have you. So we want to hear from the people. What is the change that you have been working on that requires support? You might have a really good project that not a lot of people know about and requires resourcing in some way and maybe couldn't be replicated, across the country or in different parts of the world. But you need more support for that project or initiative. We want to hear about that because these are the reparations proposals. And we know that our people haven't just been sitting back. They've had to engage in that transformatory work. And that's what we want to be hearing. We want to be putting before, policymakers, parliamentarians. So both Kobina and I are involved in, running the secretariat for the all-party parliamentary group for African reparations. And this is a big part of our work. And what will be the Commission of Inquiry. We want to hear what repairs initiatives are you working on? Because a lot of people are doing a lot of good stuff, but we're not coordinated, and we want to see synchronicity, we want to have harmonization, and we want to promote the models of excellence that we are involved in. Yeah, the second one around the UN.
To you, what does
They
Professor
say
Charles
young people are the future.
say to the UN next week? No, United Nations, yes.
What was it you've been invited for?
So yes, it's like a working group, so they're interested in different initiatives that have been going on. I've no idea how they got my name, but they're interested in particular projects that, I've been involved in over the years,
Arts, creative media.
It's not part of the working group of people of African descent, is it? Okay, all right. Okay.
It's on anti-racism.
Okay.
So there's a whole second conversation we'll have after this. And because I can only really speak for the responsibilities that I feel that we have now, and of the communities of resistance who are alive and today and actively agitating now, and who aren't represented even in our communities here, yet alone in these so-called spaces of power. And it's a difficult one because these are also questions that need to be dealt with in terms of what do we need from these spaces. And to do that, we also have to look into what can these spaces offer, and then look at their historical examples and all the rest of it. Now, the UN has obviously historically held loads of votes and actually discussions around the question of anti-racism. In the last of which, the vast majority of countries around the world voted for resolutions about commitments to racism. And it was actually countries like the United Kingdom, countries like France, Germany, the United States, who wanted to veto those positions. This is live history, like last year this stuff happened. So when we step into these places, the weight that's on your shoulder is, okay, how can we make sure that this anti-racism discussion in particular, which is one that the establishment loves to co-opt and make about, how you felt on this one day when you woke up and the weather was peak. To actually be about, okay, you say you call yourself the United Nations. You say you uphold international law. Let's apply your international law to these concrete cases. Let's apply it to our sister Florence, who's in this country.
Brother Sean, did you get your answer?
Yeah, and that's
Okay.
It's really about these cases have to be used to amplify. They have to be used to amplify the real communities that are paying attention to. And when you do that, dig into the community, speak to them, and see what they need of you. And you can organise around this very loud needs right now.
I think it's important to also know that there will be a country visit. I can't remember the exact date of the United Nations working group of experts on people of African descent to the UK to examine its anti-racism and treatment of people of African descent. And there's a lot of, the fact that the UK government has not acknowledged the United Nations International Decade for people of African descent. These are key drivers in terms of UN processes that the UK government is violating. Just says we're not going to honour it, we're not going to recognise it, we're not even going to do information kind of sessions for communities to know how to engage. That is problematic. So I think when you go into these spaces, it has to be about exposing what the UK government is failing to do. And so look at all those, CERD reports again, where you'll see what's happening in the school system, the overrepresentation of our young people in young offender institutes. There's whole kind of issues of unredressed racism that's impacting on our people. We must continually shine the light on this injustice.
Okay, I wonder if there's a sister in the house who has a question before we come to our closing remarks. Any sisters in the house?
I don't really have
Sister Makina.
Comment.
Yes.
Greetings. I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to acknowledge the young man in the video in Ghana, Yao. And I just wondered how old was he then?
I think 13 or 14 when the video was done.
Absolutely amazing. Just wanted to acknowledge that.
Thank you.
Blessings.
Thank you.
So if we can just at least tell people where they can go to at least engage with the socials and make connections with you, and to speak to Brother Madu and myself about how you get involved in building our own contribution to a global reparations plan right here in Bristol, through working with Afrikan ConneXions Consortium. On Facebook, we're also on Twitter and Instagram, Afrikan ConneX, ConneX. Okay, just want to give everyone 1 minute in terms of, yes!
You're right.
So no more. Luckily they have trains to catch. So it's 5 minutes to, so they're not going to want to miss that. So 5 to 8, I think we've got room for a minute or so, and then perhaps a little bit of networking at the end. So, who would like to start with their closing remarks? We were here to talk about the role of testimony. In doing that, we needed to have that foundational understanding of what reparations is. We needed to also consider, which we did, this question of digitization and media and the threats and opportunities involved in that. And recognizing, as they say in Jamaica, the damp is a world on a level. Okay, so Jackass says so. Okay, so there's a certain amount of inequality that's going to impact on our ability to move forward, and therefore we have a role with the privilege that we have here in working with our brothers and sisters whose resources have been ripped from them so that we have the privileges that we have here. So, I'm not going to get on that horse. Your closing remark, Kobina.
Go, you go first, it's fine.
Okay, so the follow-up for everyone in terms of basic activities that we're organising to build powerful local networks that can resource our communities of resistance globally, resource ourselves, empower our conversations we have in our homes. It's called the Planet Repairs Action Learning Educational Revolution. I'm just going to do this as a promo. Or PRADA. The website's in development, but linktree/PRADA. We are launching a fundraiser. So now about this time of year, when all of the NGOs come out to play and say, hey, donate to see some starving kids or something like this, let's actually resource real communities. Let's resource like projects that are powerful about building power. And we'll be launching the fundraiser on Friday, this Friday. You also see it on Sunday. That's chart/PRADA. You can see it on social media, which is PRADA_news. And again, I invite you because it's a question of the Planet Repairs Action Learning Education Revolution has to be built by every single one of us. There are people that are educators. That's a question for them to work on. We've got lawyers in our community. Like, I'm not going to answer those questions, but who's going to build our legal institutions? It's going to be those people doing that Planet Repairs. Who are the people interested in politics? Our teachers, our musicians. this is what we have to do now to really come together and organise seriously. And for those invited in the sort of the underbelly studying for our Pan-African community here, then you can get in touch with the Aya African Learning Community, which is the UK initiative of the Sankofa Kumba Pan-African Community Global Educational Complex. And the Aya African Learning Community, we hold study sessions, but we also are all involved in action learning. You can't be involved unless you're doing something. And we hold each other accountable, and there's a big power that I was having with my brother Kian earlier today about how do we get the link up between London and Bristol strong? And how do we share each other's success? How do we move now? And how do we see each other's forces and come and visit each other? Let's do that. So yeah.
Aya, AYA, as in the
Spell Prela.
symbol for Puchichagulia.
Prela, P-R.
Yeah, Aya African Learning.
Yes, and Prela being P-R-A-L-E-R. P-R-A-L-E-R.
Underscore news.
They were listening.
On Instagram.
Yeah, exactly. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, on Linktree, and you can sign on to the declaration, which is a powerful statement that was locally written about our perspective on education now, education for liberation and what that means, and there's more to come. And as I said, we'll be fundraising, hopefully to be able to support COSAG detachments to also take trips to communities of resistance in next summer. So there's practicalities to the force that we have to build here, and that's where these resources are going.
I'm going to move to Brother Madu for his final remarks,
Oh,
and then
yeah.
I'll come to you.
Are you giving him yours? Okay.
Very short. ACC exists, and we have on the platforms. One of the things that would worried me initially with is numbers. I don't play the numbers game anymore. It's just more about who are here rather than who aren't. Because sometimes we tend to think, oh, not many people turn up. People did. And that's important. Sometimes we miss that. So we're not an organization like many others. We don't get funding, we don't have that kind of restriction or limitations. Now, I'm sure we would welcome people on board. As this woman, we're having a Kwanzaa car on the 30th of December at the Malcolm Center. And I think that would be a useful platform to get on board. There's also Sister Judith in the audience. If you need to find us, ACC, you can go via her. So please, we are confident that we're moving in the right direction, and therefore any support we can get, we look forward.
And to also mention the Pan-African Council of Elders, the Kobina Amokwandoh, that we have established in Bristol as part of our own governance structures, because governance is an essential aspect of nation building. And Kobina talked about, the various institutions that are part of strong nations. And so we have to do these things within the levels of our Ma'atubuntajamas or communities that we are part of. So there are very practical things that ones can communicate and engage with. So yes, don't be a stranger after today. Please don't do this intellectual masturbation thing that you just go home and watch. I don't know, Goggle Box is it or something?
Google Box.
Breaking Bad.
I don't know, whatever it is.
Love Island.
Think about
Oh gosh.
and I'm a celebrity in a day and I'm Okay, Sister Esther, your final remarks.
So yes, just honing it back down to the I Am Witness, we are witness as part of the Stop the Maangamizi campaign that is linked to the only kind of, now emerging reparations process that is being recognised that can address the massive kind of group injustices that all of our families and community members across the world and here, there and everywhere have been experiencing. Part of this process is organising what we're calling community listening sessions, which is where we are looking for partners in Bristol who will partner with us to also reach out amongst your constituencies to be able to hear testimony, gather testimony amongst different kind of spheres of interest and influence that you already have. So consider doing that consider partnering with us in terms of offering up spaces. If you have, this is a nice space where we can have these community sessions to talk, like town hall meetings with our people, so they can understand how this is really important in getting their voice heard. And what you'll find is that in reparations processes for our people around the world, the one in the UK is the only one that is participatory, meaning that we're trying to drive it so that ordinary people have a say, as opposed to experts, even if they're from our community, who speak on behalf of everybody, yeah, and then sit down at negotiating tables and say, oh, we want this money for our university, like what happened with the Glasgow University of the West Indies deal. But yet the very people who were the ones who were the enslaved, who produced that label, like as descendants, we're totally out of the picture. That is unacceptable because, as I said in the beginning, reparations is a right of victims under international law, not states, not universities. If we choose to say, well, this is where we want, you know, resources to go, that's different. But we have to be the ones actually determining what that strategy is. So please take advantage of this, because we're battling a lot of the elites in our communities who want to shut people like all of us out. And we're sort of saying, no, you can't do that. Yes, there's a role for government, but you can't, you know, usurp the role of communities and individuals and particular families that have been impacted. This is historic. So please join with us so that we can host these community listening sessions. We can come out and find what are the specific realities here in Bristol, because there's a global dimension. What are the community projects, programs and initiatives that are trying to tackle the issues of the beef, the gun and knife crime amongst our young people, the school exclusions, the family separations, the children being taken into local authority care. All of this, which is actually part of the disrepair and impacting on our powerlessness and therefore our inability to actually be self-determining. And a big part of that repair is dignity restoration. Yeah, that to know that we are a people, we are a community. We're not just kind of beneficiaries of government projects and aid projects and, you know, other kinds of things because we can't speak for ourselves. So that's what I would say. We're also looking for researchers who can assist with the Apsitaj, with the Ubuntu Gotla. We're particularly looking at people who are in universities, because universities are good places where research naturally happens. We can get students working on holding local sessions. Film it, it goes around the world, and that would be so powerful as a global initiative, just like the I Am Witness video that was actually shot here in Bristol, yeah? Filmed here in Bristol. That's really important as a contribution to our global organizing as a people.
So I'm hoping that you would have seen and heard where you see your place in this movement today. There really is something that has been said today that you can latch onto and be part of and make your contribution. At the very least, if you're not sure, you just throw money at it until you are sure. Yes? So I want to thank you all for taking the time to come out in this minus whatever it is when you go out there. And for those of you who may get charged in the clean air zone going home, say it go. We have to take the rough with the smooth if we want these things to make a difference to our lives, you know. Yes, Kwanzaa Karamu, the 30th of December at the Malcolm X Centre, 2 till 8 p.m. We are hoping, they're just hearing this invitation, by the way, that they will be back for us to have these focus, what we call Saba circles, linked to the Nguvu Saba, so we can have those conversations on key policy areas, particularly health, education, and cooperative economics, which are all part of that journey towards a Pan-African community education complex that we're trying to establish with Garful and with our brothers and sisters across continents also. Thanks again to all the backroom supporters, audio-visual organisers, and Black Southwest Network and the entire staff team for tonight and for this whole museum series that's happened in Bristol. And please make sure you visit their website, sign up to their newsletter. And what I will ask them to do, and we will also do on the Afrikan ConneXions Consortium, is put some of the key links, social media, websites, email addresses on both of our social media so that we can make sure that you know where you can go to get further information and to be practically and actively involved. Thanks to our panel, Brother Kobina Amokwandoh, Sister Esther Stanford-Xosei, Brother Madu Ellis, Afrikan ConneXions Consortium.
And
Yes, I'm good. Thank you very much.
So can we have